Yes, that's the first illicit trade lunch webinar that we do in 2022. And we have a very interesting presentation by Stephen van Bockstael on, as you can see already, the title, Decontaminating Networks, Mercury Supply, Financial Flows, and Informal Gold Mining in West Africa. Before I leave the floor, I give the floor to Stephen. Stephen is a colleague in the IRIO department and one of the founding fathers or founding members of ITG, so we're very happy to have him on board and sharing his research today. We also wanted to say a couple of things on the illicit trade group, not much, just for you to know what we are. We are one of the groups established under the Sustainable Society at the University of Groningen. And we, it's now about 30 members at the RUG. We are now looking also for people who are interested. And we're also trying to organize a couple of extra activities. So for instance, we organize two illicit trade events, a winter school and a summer school. The winter school starts next week, and then we have the summer school in July. And then normally it's the last week of January for the winter school and the first week of July for the summer school. And so we are very, we are looking also forwards to further cooperating with some of you or with all of you if we can manage to have some contribution in the programs. Now, the online versions are a bit shorter teaching-wise, but we hope that when we go back in person, we can also have broader discussions with some of the members of ITG. We are also in discussions, so thanks to the support of Sustainable Society as well. We try to put together a few working groups when it comes to grant applications. We have now, we have been discussing and talking among ourselves with also people outside of the network of ITG, especially for the Horizon Europe calls. So if you see anything that might be of interest, let us know. So we are happy to facilitate and to provide some either support or simply to create a space for discussing these joint projects. And then we also wanted to make sure that we all understand what we really mean when we talk about illicit trade. The idea of talking about illicit trade is not only about talking the mere trading part, but the whole part of anytime that there is an exchange of goods or financial exchange. So the means that facilitate the exchange of goods, but also the infrastructure that facilitates or allows this, or the consequences of illicit trade. And then, of course, the way in which you can think of in many ways, but what we like to talk about these three S: security, safety, and sustainability, as looking at the potential implications for illicit trade activities. That's also another way for us to think and frame the issues that we talk about, and also to extend and have further cooperation with other people within a sustainable society in the other groups that are active, but also going beyond. So feel free to contact us. We are happy to have informal chats, but also more semi-formal or formal events on topics and research ideas that we want to pursue. And of course, Pim Gergoed is the other coordinator of the illicit trade group. If I'm forgetting anything, Pim, at any point in time, feel free to jump in and tell me. But having said that, I don't want to take further time away from Stephen van Bockstael. As I said, he's a colleague, assistant professor here at the Faculty of Arts in the Department of International Relations and International Organization. He has a very diverse background, but super interesting. I mean, I really like what he does. Personally, I like what I'm very interested in his research. And I think that there is a lot to learn from his work. So without further ado, Stephen, thank you very much again for joining us today. And well, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I have a quick mic check so that people do hear me?
Yes, please. I do.
Perfect. Welcome everyone. For those of you that are about to start eating their lunch, enjoy, bon appetit. We're going to be talking about Mercury, financial flows, and informal gold mining in West Africa. So let's get to it. Basically, my main subject is artisanal and small-scale mining. So artisanal small-scale mining can also be described as simply the historically dominant form of mining. Before we have what is contemporarily the dominant form of mining, which is capital intensive, highly industrialized mining, which produces the majority of the world's minerals. Artisanal mining, what we now call artisanal and small-scale mining, is simply the dominant form of mining throughout history. The gold rush, the idea of the gold rush is also something with which most of you will be familiar. Many of you have this sort of 19th century image of the gold rush in our minds. Mythical places like the Klondike in Canada, Transvaal in South Africa, the Pilbara in Australia. You've got Minas Gerais in Brazil, etc., etc. So there's like hundreds of places across the world that simply became world famous, if you can call it that, in a single month because of major discoveries prompting gold rushes, people flocking to those sites in search of a better life, basically. Associated with quote unquote anarchy and lawlessness, has a bit of a reputation with it. Also associated with sort of ruptures in society, ruptures in time, where previous boundaries such as class and to a lesser extent race became less important. They're still very much visible if you look for it, of course, but not as important as in the rest of the society, which just rumbles on. Gold rushes also represent this moment of opportunity, opportunity for immense riches, but also the problem of great despair. People that find fabulous wealth and then lose it all because they keep on gambling. We're not just talking about people who do actual mining, but also everything around it. So there's a whole secondary economy. The saying goes, in a gold rush, sell shovels. One of those famous sellers of shovels was Levi Strauss, who didn't sell shovels. He sold what we now know as jeans. So basically, the gold rush is very familiar, easily recognizable, has also acquired this sort of metonymic capacity to refer to not only mining booms of various minerals. Today would be, for example, the lithium boom, the lithium gold rush, but also to other non-mining related episodes of fast wealth generation, which then exerts a powerful attraction on outsiders, the proverbial gold seekers, to participate in such a rush, join the newly emerging industry. Cryptocurrency is a good example of a contemporary gold rush, even though here there's an explicit link to mining. I did the research yesterday. They're about 12 seasons in Discovery Channel's Gold Rush show. They have a handful of spin-offs directly associated with that series and a whole bunch of other independent series such as Jungle Gold, not to be confused with the Jungle spin-off of Gold Rush. You've got stuff in Australia, you've got other stuff in Canada, for National Geographic has Yukon Gold. Also in fiction, there's been a significant increase based on the success of this gold rush. I'm not sure if it's a reality show, but anyway, Discovery made a very okay mini-series about the Klondike. Canal+ in France commissioned a fiction series called Guyane about illegal gold mining in French Guyana. And of course, there's HBO's Deadwood, which ended way too soon, if you ask me. Now, all of this can be easily interpreted if you look at the graph on the left, depicting the gold price in US dollars per gram. It's normally in ounces, but imperial makes my brain hurt, and metric is probably easiest to understand for everyone. The fundamental point here is not the actual price, it's just a plot of the graph, which looks just the same in imperial. So gold prices today are between 4 and 6 times what they were in the 1990s. This has an impact on people's lives. So that explains the Discovery shows at the very least. From my perspective, it's quite strange to see this interest, if not exactly a glorification of what they're doing, of these North Americans mining for gold. and contrast this to the increasing criminalization of basically poor people doing pretty much the same thing in developing countries the world over. They're not making reality shows about that. So what is artisanal mining? Artisanal mining is the largely manual exploitation of minerals using basic tools, sometimes handmade tools. We're talking here about picks and shovels and a batia or a circular gold miner span. You can add technology, of course, as you need it, a water pump to go below the water level, a small excavator perhaps. Gold miners, washing plants is usually the first thing they buy or rent or lease or whatever, which also requires a water pump. But all of that is extra. You can do this with a pick, a shovel, and a gold miner span. And all of these extra expenses, of course, bring in extra additional costs, not just buying or renting the equipment, transporting it to very remote areas, but also the fuel that you need to power all of this. Those are all costs that need to be deducted from potential winnings. So in general, for artisanal mining, mechanization remains limited, capital requirements are low. It is, on the other hand, very labor intensive. So artisanal mining as it occurs in many places around the world today, so on the right is today, is very similar to what we've seen in history, which is obviously on the left, which is why it's important to beware, I think, of the idea of linear evolutionism. Many people believe that artisanal mining is some kind of an atavist remnant of the past. However, the properties of the resource mined are very crucial to consider, as is the geology in which all of this is situated. Some types of resources in some types of places are simply not economical to be mined in any way that is capital intensive, which is why it's only economical in very poor places where labor is cheap and abundant. This is where people's self-exploitation becomes an issue. Another key thing, very important to remember here, is how artisanal mining dovetails with rural employment. So given a context of de-agrarianization and what some have called de-peasantization since the late 1980s, artisanal mining, even though it's always been there in the background, especially in West Africa for gold, has steadily assumed ever greater importance since the 1980s. In many African countries today, and sort of this is where I start zooming in a bit on sub-Saharan Africa, it's one of the most important, if not the most important, rural non-farm livelihoods. So artisanal and small-scale mining, or ASM. I use ASM as the acronym, but I'm talking exclusively or almost exclusively about what others would refer to as artisanal mining. The problem is there's not really a clear definition, a boundary between the A and the S, between artisanal and small scale. A lot of time was spent in the 1980s, for example, to figure out where this boundary really is, but it's ultimately a useless discussion, right? Context matters much more than whether it is artisanal or small scale according to certain rules. Those guys from the Discovery Gold Rush show, they're deep into semi-industrial small-scale mining territory. They're using machinery that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, requires enormous amounts of fuel. That's absolutely not what we're talking about here when we're talking about artisanal mining in West Africa. Numbers. Well, the most recent numbers date from 2017. Why 2017? Because obviously everything went pear-shaped during COVID. We really have no idea how that has influenced numbers. Those numbers, so 40 million workers, that means people who descend into the earth or people who wash gold and things like that. So directly involved in recovering minerals, 40 million people worldwide, half of which are in the gold mining business. So you can add your own calculations on how many people are dependent on that one person's income. So you do times 2, you do times 3, times 4 sometimes, etc. Global non-fuel mineral production, artisanal mining is responsible for about 15 to 20% of it. So it's 20 to 25% of diamond production, 15 to 20% of gold production. There are outliers in the DRC, for example, Democratic Republic of the Congo. 90% of what is mined in that country is mined by artisanal miners. So this is definitely a resurgence because artisanal mining obviously never went away. It was always there. And especially since the 1980s, we can see this resurgence dovetailing with de-agrarization because of structural adjustment, as well as liberalization of mining codes, legalizing artisanal mining. Obviously, there's a massive data gap. We're talking about a sector that is largely informal, is also not a static industry, very vulnerable to commodity super cycles, mineral price fluctuations in general, changing socioeconomic context and competition over resources, and of course, state repression. The table at the bottom is from a good recent study giving a reliable overview of the number of artisanal mining operators in Africa. So again, these are miners and people directly involved with producing the minerals. So you can see that this is happening in 40 countries, which is to say pretty much all of them. So that's from 2014. Artisanal mining has a bad and depending on your perspective, horrible reputation. So when you talk about artisanal mining, you also need to talk about labor exploitation. Some NGOs have called it a quote-unquote new form of slavery. We have the problem of child labor present. There's historical links with conflict. Many of you will remember conflict diamonds, the conflict minerals episode in Eastern DRC. Quickly mention here that this didn't cause the conflicts yet. Artisanally mined minerals did provide financial inputs and incentives to keep those conflicts going, perhaps longer than they would have otherwise. There's also a big history of environmental degradation, which we'll zoom in a bit more in a bit. Mercury and cyanide for gold mining, for example, or just pollution of water streams using just by moving them, introducing silt, etc., etc. Negative social dynamics, which is a bit of a catch-all. Kids don't go to school, rise of prostitution, quote-unquote invasion of indigenous communities, which in West African contexts sort of reignite debates about, okay, who is really indigenous and who was here first. And from the perspective of governments, this prevents or is alleged to prevent FDI-led, foreign direct investment-led industrialization. So this last one is pretty important because in many African countries, mining legislation, which obviously also covers artisanal mining, has a very strong bias in favor of large-scale mining, flowing from the idea that large-scale mining is more professional, less wasteful of the resource as small-scale mining, ultimately, of course, revolving around the idea of taxation and the fact that artisanal mining is simply a poor man's game. So large-scale mining is prioritized, and with it, increased revenue for the state, which ideally can be used for industrialization, modernization, and a few. The diamond industry, for example, or at least parts of it, are increasingly looking at synthetics for jewelry. They've been using synthetics for industrial purposes in the 70s. This is now synthetics for jewelry purposes, as a way to conveniently cut themselves off from these negative externalities, which they can't really influence, but which really hurts their reputation. In this, this is an activity in rural areas of development, developing countries. So the international development sector has something to say about this, or should have something to say about this. Unfortunately, they don't have very interesting things to say about it. Development mainstream really continues its focus on smallholder agriculture, which was often destroyed by structural adjustment, de-agrarization processes, and doesn't really recognize the fact that artisanal mining is an exit strategy for many rural people, is an alternative livelihood. So the idea that alternative livelihoods somehow need to be created for artisanal mining completely ignores the fact that artisanal mining is the alternative livelihood. What's very clear is that artisanal mining has alleviated significant rural hardship, reinvigorated deteriorating smallholder farming activities, and catalyzed growth of infrastructure and reduced rural-urban migration across sub-Saharan Africa. Unfortunately, it's also very political. Who really owns these resources? Is it the state that owns the mineral resources, just because that's what colonial powers imposed? It's not all that difficult to look at informal mining and see in it an example of the clash between so-called modern and pre-modern conceptions of property and ownership, but also moral economy. There are some who see artisanal mining as a sort of resource appropriation from below, if you will, who see in this resistance an act of semi-sabotage even when it comes to competition with large-scale mines. The development mainstream, despite the whole literature on the resource curse, not going into whether it is there or it isn't, still very much believes in resource-led economic modernization, and people who mine minerals for a living shouldn't be the target of development aid because we can sell this to our public. That's also something that I've heard quite a lot. What are we talking about in Africa today? So in the 1980s, as I've said, artisanal mining had a bit of a resurgence. This also resulted in increased policy attention to what was then called small-scale mining in developing countries. So again, structural adjustment programs, economic decline results in that sort of resurgence of an activity that is very much historical in West Africa. The analysis of ASM in that time, so we're talking 1980s, 1990s, was a bit mistaken, focusing a lot on a sort of get-rich-quick mentality that people were to have, the casino economy of, you keep digging, but you're never really sure what you're going to find. The idea that these people are rogue entrepreneurs, completely ignoring that if it is entrepreneurship, it is entrepreneurship of necessity and of survival rather than one of opportunity. Today, there's really a broad consensus that artisanal mining is poverty-driven. So various push-pull factors, historical activity, presence of large-scale mining that sort of encourages people to do something. But all of this is really determined by the structural poverty of miners and those involved in sort of the ancillary industries. Issues like conspicuous consumption really need to be seen in this context. Same thing with what's called bitter money, which sort of touches upon familiar taboos in West Africa, where supernatural traits are really attributed to gold, requiring their neutralization. If you do not neutralize these supernatural traits, well then your gains will be ill-gotten and you will be punished for it. So you, as a result, can do all you want with money gained from mining, which sort of explains wastage of that money. In the Central African Republic, the money coming from diamond mining was largely seen as l'argent du diable, the money of the devil. So you're very much limited in the choices what you can do with that money. There will be curses upon your house if you build your house with that kind of money. Obviously, this is something that's sort of culturally evolving. Used to be true a lot more 40 years ago than it is now. If you talk to young miners, they will tell you a lot less about this than older ones. As I said, alternatives to an alternative livelihood, this idea that artisanal mining isn't very nice, so we need to find better things for people to do, ignores the fact that artisanal mining is one of those better things for people to do. Simply put, artisanal mining is sort of a combination of poverty and geology. That's fundamentally what determines whether any given country will be confronted with artisanal mining. There needs to be a geological potential. It needs to be an easily accessible, sometimes called secondary or alluvial deposit. There also needs to be a need, the need that comes from structural poverty and limited livelihood opportunities. It's a fundamental part of the informal economy. It can impact large-scale mining activities, and as a result, most governments don't like it very much. So it's often illegal, but very much legitimate. So we're talking about local norms here. We're talking about moral economy. Licensing processes are cumbersome, are expensive, which makes sure that formalization becomes difficult, if not impossible. A big reason of that is also the large-scale bias, the bias in favor of attracting foreign direct investment. It's difficult to control, at least if you think of it as needing the same kind of regulation as a large-scale mining sector, when in reality it requires basically a comprehensive approach involving rural development officials as well as mining ministries. This doesn't really happen. More so than with, for example, diamond mining, gold miners, artisanal gold miners are also frequently in competition with large-scale gold miners. That is to say, they're trespassing on vast claims, whether there's a mining operation in that claim or part of that claim, or whether the claim is part of an exploration license where research may be ongoing or which may simply have been leased for speculative purposes, doesn't really matter. It's someone else's property, and in most countries means that it's impossible to get an artisanal mining license on such a claim, even if you really, really want to become a formalized miner. The result of that is, of course, that it's extremely difficult for government to control, monitor informal mining occurring over vast territories. This is that sort of open access geology problem, as opposed to, for example, a single industrial mining, put an electrified fence around it and you're done. Especially given its association with structural poverty, without which this would not be an attractive livelihood. Anyway, a really good example of this, so that this poverty and geology requirement can be found in the US state of Arkansas, once home to a diamond rush of quite epic proportions during the Great Depression. The subsequent economic boom made sure that everyone soon had much easier jobs, making much more money. The diamond fields and the diamond rush soon became forgotten, and somewhere along the way, the land was bought by the state government, turned it into a state park with the historical mission of remembering that diamond rush. Today, artisanal diamond mining is a tourist attraction. The geology is still largely the same, of course a bit less rich than it was originally, but there's no more poverty. They do keep a log of findings. You can see that on the bottom. Nothing spectacular to be sure, but also nothing that artisanal miners the world over would throw away. There's no more poverty, which means that you have one part of the equation missing, which means it's no longer interesting. Now, unlike large-scale mining investment, artisanal miners can get started from one day to the next, running its course in a matter of weeks or months. And this obviously has implications for a licensing system that even in theory requires a lengthy waiting period before you can even legally commence mining, let alone making any kind of money. This is a satellite picture taken in the late 2010s, border area of Côte d'Ivoire and Mali, nothing going on here. This is the same area in 2017. Artisanal miners start working on the bottom right. You can see the time on the top right. This is what happens in a couple of months, and I hope this works. Yes, so January, February, March, April. So it goes rather quickly, and it's very easy to see how governments might perceive this as a threat, especially when that government is trying to attract foreign investment to exploit those same resources. So artisanal mining has been sort of the subject of repeated formalization attempts. What do I mean with formalization? Formalized artisanal mining is legal, is formally authorized according to various mining, labor, environmental, etc., legislation. You have different waves of formalization from colonial into post-colonial times. The big problem is that it persists in informality. The problem is that a number of barriers must really be overcome in order for miners to be in a position to formalize that is in any way realistic. We've already seen how artisanal mining is often misunderstood. So in my view, it's not simply a small scale mining issue, it's also a development issue which is not recognized as such. High costs of entry, regulatory obstacles means that it's very difficult, it's not impossible for people to formalize. Couple that with a geology of open access clearly suggests that we need to go to formalization that needs to be induced rather than enforced. There's also the problem of limited enforcement capacity because we're in a developing country. So with a regulatory framework that's ill-adapted to these realities of artisanal mining and a very limited enforcement capacity, we can actually turn this question around. Why shouldn't informality persist? Why even bother formalizing your operation? So fundamentally, there's no credible, sustainable pathways to formalized artisanal mining. And if you remember those gold rush shows that I spoke about in the beginning, so Discovery Channel commissioned a series called Jungle Gold set in Ghana. It lasted only 2 seasons because when they were filming the second season, the first season was airing in Ghana and led to the immediate arrest warrant of all the miners as well as the entire Discovery Channel TV crew. Because guess what? They were mining without the proper licenses. They were mining illegally. And rather than risk arrest, spend some time behind bars in Accra awaiting a trial, the crew fled from the country. Really, really interesting kind of behind the scenes view there. Now, how does this work in practice? Well, there's been an increased attention to formalization, to the idea of a more traceable supply chain. This is a direct result of the Kimberley process for rough diamonds, conflict minerals legislation in the US, the European Union, so new legal dynamics. You have all sorts of experiments going on with the blockchain today, etc. Traceability is really much more important now than it was 10 years ago. I'm not going to discuss too much these initiatives by player in the mining industry, which are largely performative and about making it clear that you're doing something without doing actually things that have an impact on the ground. But anyway, what is happening in practice is that you're sort of bumping into the limits of formalization, as I explained previously, but you also have a sort of regulatory syncretism, a mixing of different norms and codes of conduct with legal rational mixing in with informal, which we can call informal formalization, to borrow a term from the land tenure and the land rights people, very much sort of in the slipstream of 1980s debates on legal pluralism, if you remember the Von Benda Beckhams and that kind of work. So we're talking about a legal gray area where there's a lot of complicitness, if not outright collaboration of government officials, especially the local ones. So people can start or even continue mining illegally while they're sort of, applying for a mining license. So you're going through the motions. They keep busy, which adds a veneer of official approval. In Liberia, for example, this process of local formalization is semi-institutionalized through the so-called clearance fee, which is an informally given 90-day reprieve to apply for a license while continuing to mine. So some people work on the mine and then some other people go to Monrovia to officially request permission. It's completely illegal. It's not in any mining code and any government regulation. And if you talk to government officials, they say, "Oh no, this is not illegal. This is not legal because this is corruption." However, for quite a long time, it was on the official government website as part of the formalization process, and it is of course step one that needs to be taken if you talk to anyone who actually went through this process. One thing that is also important to keep in mind is this idea of what is the state, which is also the question of who is the state. In these rural areas, you do not have a sort of plethora of different state representatives. You have a handful of people who all have something to do with mining. They all know that is happening. This is not something that is happening completely unknown. So when these local people tell you that if you follow certain steps, you can continue to do so, this is basically the state allowing you to mine. Whether those local officials pass things up to the capital or keep some money in their pocket is really nobody's business. And miners really shouldn't be penalized for the way that government officials, people who have bachelor and master's degrees, are paid $150 a month to basically monitor vast areas. Now, on to the second part. This is a smaller part. Mercury. Basically highly volatile elemental mercury is able to transform from liquid to vapor even at room temperature. This vapor is odorless, is colorless, and is extremely toxic and extremely sticky. So if you inhale this, that's one of the most dangerous forms of exposure to mercury you can get. Mercury also gets into the water. If it gets into aquatic systems, bacteria transform it into methyl mercury, which is even more toxic than elemental mercury. Once methylated, this is then absorbed by plankton, which is then absorbed by shellfish, which is then absorbed by fish, etc. You get the picture until it ends up in mammals such as us. Major public health environmental damage here. And in 2013, the Minamata Convention on Mercury was signed, which is an international treaty designed to protect human health and the environment from anthropogenic emissions and release of mercury and mercury compounds. Named after the Japanese city of Minamata, where a big disaster happens. Minamata disease is the name we give to very severe neurological disease caused by severe mercury poisoning. So this is where mercury poisoning, mercury usage and loss enters into gold mining. You basically use it to create an amalgam, to separate the gold from basically the dirt, whether that's gravity concentrated gold or whether that's whole gold, two different ways. At both techniques result into the release of mercury into water, into air, into people's lungs, because one of the things that you need to do once you have an amalgam is to apply heat. What is the best way to apply heat? You light things on fire, which is really problematic because sometimes it's done basically in people's courtyards, using the pots and pans, which they then use for cooking a few hours later. So this is extremely dangerous stuff. Why do people use mercury in the artisanal gold mining world? Because it's so easy. It's very easy to use as a single person. It's a one-person job, so you can do it independently. It's incredibly effective in the field to separate gold from dirt. It's very accessible. It is ubiquitously accessible, and it is very cheap. It is not as cheap as it was in the 1990s, mind you. There's been a strong increase in price since the 2010s, but it is still cheap when you compare it to what you can get out of mercury in terms of gold. So how big is the issue really of mercury in artisanal mining? Well, we don't really know. What we do know is that mercury is responsible, artisanal gold mining is responsible for about 38% of global mercury pollution, which is the number one anthropogenic source of mercury pollution. So it's the big ticket on the agenda of the Minamata Convention, for example, but we have very limited information because we're talking about informal mining and an informal mercury trade. We do, of course, have widespread evidence of mercury usage throughout West African ASM sites. There's been a growing policy appetite to tackle this problem of mercury contamination to artisanal mining in the 21st century. Most recently, of course, we have the Minamata Convention, that sort of requires all of the signatories, so went into force in 2017, that have more than insignificant activities of artisanal and small-scale gold mining on their territory to develop a national action plan, or NAP, which basically needs to include measures to reduce and ultimately phase out and eliminate mercury usage in the gold mining sector. The big problem here is that step one is formalize artisanal mining, and then step two is, make sure the miners don't use mercury as much. Step one, of course, is the stuff that's given, thousands of policymakers and government officials sleepless nights since the colonial era. You simply cannot formalize a vibrant informal sector without first understanding the very good reasons why it operates informally. So step one is a bit more like, Donald Trump's very small $1 million loan that he needed to kickstart his business empire. So this is not a very realistic suggestion as part of the solution to, big policy conundrum. When I say, conundrum, when I say problem, this is obviously a very Western technocratic assessment. I'm a political scientist. I'm looking at how stuff actually works. And it's clear that this problem is not really identified as such by everyone. partly related to the LSM bias I discussed earlier. You don't want to make it easier for artisanal miners to formalize, but also the idea that informality begets opportunity for some. And especially in post-conflict settings in particular, there are very good reasons not to start rocking particular boats. Now, comparatively little attention's been spent on the politics of implementing mercury reduction, and there's been little regard really for the economic and spatial dynamics of mercury supply. And the national action plans, while heavy on the environment and such, they really fail to capture details of the microeconomies fueling the distribution of mercury to all of these different artisanal mining sites, which is really about fundamental transnational supply chains. So if you sort of step one is formalization, then step two assumes that all of a sudden we don't have porous borders anymore. And again, this is all part of Pan-African history, really, gold mining, stretching all the way to Mansa Musa in the 14th century, which the richest person to walk this planet. Artisanal mining being the region's most important rural non-farm activity. So the idea that your policy success depends on achieving something that has not yet been achieved in, a very long time of trying, in some countries, almost 100 years of efforts to crack down on quote-unquote illegal mining. It can get worse. So there's already a bit of a default of rather heavy-handed, forceful anti-artisanal mining policies, threatening, of course, the livelihoods of millions. But Minamata carries with it certain dangers, in the sense that some of these overly voluntaristic policies can not only be catastrophic economically, but in a worst-case scenario can also provide pretty much an international legal argument for the use of force. This is very similar to what happened in Zimbabwe in 2006, when the Zimbabwean government, when Comrade Bob was still in charge, used the Kimberley process for rough diamonds as a sort of pretext for pretty much a military assault on illegal diamond miners in the Marange region, never minding the fact that this illegal mining was at least partially state-sponsored. And then, of course, an additional concern is the increasing penetration of artisanal gold trading chains in the West African Sahel by jihadist groups. So this is where we get in, and I'm pretty much done with this presentation in a bit. We have a bit of funding from the International Growth Centre, which is largely funded by UK International Development and jointly managed by the LSE and the University of Oxford. We've got a small grant, about £20,000. Supposedly a short and flexible grant. COVID made this somewhat of an adventure. We submitted in February 2020, got good news informally. Bad email in April 2020, got rejected because of COVID. Fast forward, end of 2020, we got asked if we still want the money. Yeah, we do. So we'll work something out. We've been working something out, and in August 2021, we get an official letter saying, congratulations, we have the grant. Let's now arrange the fine print, completely change all of the deadlines, and sign the contract. The contract wasn't signed until mid-December 2021, so that's basically a month ago. Field research in Sierra Leone and Liberia is going to commence shortly, COVID willing. It's going to be a mixed method crew. Presence of quantitative analysis is actually one of the requirements of the funder. So that's where Tim Lang, which is our economist, comes in. Other members of the team is Gavin Hilson from Surrey, who's a bit of a legend in the artisanal mining world. What we're actually trying to do, and I promise this is my final slide, we're trying to come up with a comprehensive analysis of these networks catalyzing mercury supply in the ECOWAS region. And in this sort of system, this network, there are hierarchies of specialization and technological innovation, in which Ghana and Burkina Faso rank at the very top. In many countries, increased specialization of artisanal mining is evident through technological innovation, notably the introduction of mercury at first, then jerry-rigged washing plants to separate the gold from the earth and gravel, milling machines, and ultimately culminating in the construction of, big, heavy, fearsome cyanide tanks for chemical leaching. This all comes from, Ghanaians, Burkina Faso, Burkinabe, who are sort of the consultants of the artisanal small-scale world. We have a pretty good hunch, based on our previous research in the region, that there's a key role to be played here by the deepwater freeports of Lomé and Togo. And we will look in particular at Liberia and Sierra Leone. Why? Because they are the most recent geographical additions to this transboundary network. When I started out doing fieldwork in Liberia in 2009, 2010, Mercury was completely absent. People weren't very much interested in gold mining. They were doing diamond mining. Gold was a nice to have byproduct, but not really essential. That's now completely changed. And so we're trying to figure out how that sort of change has happened. As I said, this is explained by historical dominance of artisanal diamond mining, why they don't have mercury. They didn't have mercury until pre-2010. So we now have an opportunity to study these networks while they are still sort of in the assembling phase. We're trying to gauge the embeddedness of mercury in the artisanal mining landscape, identify key actors involved in distributing these supplies to artisanal mining sites in country, and uncovering the details about the roles they play in facilitating its circulation, and obviously also estimating or trying to estimate the corresponding financial flows and the commerce linking its supply from country capitals to the site level. This has been sort of debated, so mercury, policies, etc., mostly in environmental science and health journals, but discussions about the economics of mercury and the politics of all of these the implementation of these policies have not really gained a lot of visibility and traction in those journals. So we're really trying to transcend this discussion about human health by nuancing the artisanal mining sector's socioeconomic dimension and this interface with a very dynamic, largely unmapped network of actors responsible for mercury to artisanal mining sites. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Perfect, Stephen. Thank you very much for this very informative presentation. And I think now we can stop the recording so we can have our Q&A. We have